So I believe we can begin the session, and I would like us to start with a word of prayer. And as we start, I just want to note that I'll be your co-host for this webinar. I'll be co-hosting with the CEO of the Institute of Engineers of Kenya. So I would like to welcome a volunteer to lead us in a word of prayer as we start this webinar.
Let's pray. My name is Sani Nzavela. Our Father, we come before you this moment with thanksgiving. Thank you for the occasion that you have given us to be able to deliberate on this issue of street addressing in this country. We are so grateful for all the brains that you have brought together and the inspirations. We thank you and we honor you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for that word of prayer.
Amen.
Thank you for that word of prayer. As we start up, because I know the participants are from various institutions, and I would just like to give you an overview. The Institution of Engineers of Kenya works through committees, and one of those committees is the Policy Research and Advocacy Committee, where I'm the chairperson. The other committee is the Capacity Building and Mentorship Committee, where Engineer Grace Kagondu is the chair. On this issue of the street design manual and this webinar, we've organized it in collaboration between PRAC, the Policy Research and Advocacy Committee, and the Capacity Building and Mentorship Committee. The program had been presented earlier, and without wasting any more time, I would like to invite Engineer Grace Kagondu, who is the chairperson of the Capacity Building and Mentorship Committee of the Institution of Engineers of Kenya, to make her welcoming remarks, and then proceed to welcome the President of the Institution of Engineers of Kenya to make his remarks. Thank you, and welcome, Engineer Grace Kagondu.
Yes. Welcome.
Engineer Kagondu, are you there?
Yes, I am. Good morning, everyone. Yes.
Good morning.
So I thank you, Engineer Justus. I think I'll immediately go straight away to the welcoming remarks.
Good morning.
Colleagues and distinguished members of the Institution of Engineers of Kenya, it is really my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar, the second webinar by the Capacity Building and Mentorship Committee of IEK since its formation just less than 2 months ago. I would like to start by acknowledging the presence of first, the Engineer Francis Gitau, Infrastructure Secretary, State Department for Infrastructure, the Ministry of Transport, Infrastructure, Housing, Urban Development, and Public Works. I would also like to acknowledge Engineer Nathaniel Mathalanga, President of IEK, and of course, our key facilitators today, the team from Itdp, Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, led by Chris Cost, the Program Director, Itdp Africa, Engineer Jerry Mburu, the Transport Planning Manager, and Gabriel Gitau, the Transport Planning Associate. I would like at this juncture to also acknowledge the IEK Council members present. I'm not sure how many are present, but especially those who have been working with the Capacity Building Committee and the Policy Research and Advocacy Committee in preparing for this webinar. We have Engineer Margaret Ogai, the Honorary Secretary of IEK, Engineer Justice Otwani, the Chairman of Policy Research and Advocacy Committee, who will be our moderator for the Q&A session discussions, and also the co-host. And we also have Engineer Shama Kiteme, the Vice Chair, Capacity Building and Mentorship Committee, who will summarize the way forward before Engineer Ogai wraps up with a vote of thanks. Colleagues, the focus of today's webinar is a proposed Street Design Manual for Urban Areas in Kenya. This manual has been developed by the Ministry of Transport, Infrastructure, Housing and Urban Development and Public Works in partnership with the Global Road Safety Fund and Itdp. Our aim in this webinar is to unpack this manual, discuss it, and put out the views from our members who will be largely the ones to implement the recommendations and the designs proposed in the manual. You are all invited to participate actively and be part of its further development so as to create a document that we can work with, that we can appreciate, and that we can effectively transform the way we design streets in a manner that is responsive to today's needs and challenges, especially the rapid urbanization, air pollution, and remember the urgent need to include sustainable modes of transport and improve safety for vulnerable road users, the pedestrians and cyclists, whom we have tended to neglect to a large extent. Please note, participants, there will be a 10-minute comfort break at around 11:50 after the main presentation. And then after the break, we will move to the question and answer session. And finally, we will have a wrap-up session by Engineer Margaret Ogai. Well, I hope that today will be a fruitful learning and sharing experience. Remember that this event will earn all participants 5 CPD points. Once again, a very warm welcome to each and every one of you. Remember, if you have any questions, suggestions, clarifications as we go along, just post them in the chat box and they will be picked up by the discussants. Thank you very much for listening. And now it is my pleasure to welcome the President of IK, Engineer Nathaniel Matalanga, to give now the opening remarks. Karibu sana, Mr. President. Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Engineer Grace. And thank you, Justus, for the initiative you've taken. I welcome all our members. I think we are nearing 300 now, and I'm very excited that we have gotten time to attend this webinar. This is going to be a series of activities IK will carry out to try to take advantage of the restrictions we are having of COVID, but also try to keep us informed with what is happening around us, as much as we are having challenges keeping up with the professional development. But I think this is a very good way to keep us going until such time the economy will be opened up and we are able to have our normal physical meetings. As IK Council, we're really looking forward to that day when we shall have our first dinner. You know, the previous council, we had a tradition where we used to have quarterly activities, but due to the pandemic, we've not been able to have these activities. So we are really looking forward for that day when we shall have our first physical dinner, where we welcome all of you to come and we chat and share ideas. I really appreciate also the time the Infrastructure Secretary, Engineer Francis Gitau, has taken to be with us today. I can also see in attendance some quite senior members of our engineering fraternity. I can see Engineer Joseph Swachman, I can see Engineer Samuel Kathindai, and several others who have taken time to be with us. Very clear that you can never say no to knowledge. We need to keep up with the continuous professional development. To Engineer Francis Gitau, we in IK are excited to have you, and I know that you know all of us, but for the sake of members, today I'm looking at us as the engineering fraternity. So you allow me to call out my council members, those who are in the meeting. We just say your name and your position on council, and because of time, we can continue. So those who are present, I'll call out the first Vice President.
Good morning, members. I am Engineer Lucy Wanjiku Mutinda, a mechanical engineer by background. It's a pleasure to have all of you attending this webinar. And as engineers, we look forward to designing streets that are technically functional, environmentally friendly, and also very sensitive to the pedestrian use. I look forward to a knowledgeable webinar, and I hope you will all enjoy it. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you very much. I'm first VP, second Vice President of IEK. In case he's having a challenge, we can go to the Honorary Secretary. I know she's already, her name has been mentioned, but just to greet our members.
Thank you, President. Good morning, members. Thank you for attending this webinar.
The Honorary Treasurer.
Good morning, members. I'm Engineer Karen Noyola. I work for Kenya Urban Roads Authority. I'm very delighted to be part of this team today to attend this webinar. Thank you very much and feel welcome.
The immediate past president, Engineer Collins Juma. Engineer Shama Kiteme. Engineer Justus Otwani's name has been mentioned, but probably just to greet the members again as a council member.
Good morning, members. Thank you for finding time to join us for this webinar. I'm very excited, and I thank you for your support. I'm Engineer Justus Otwani. I'm the chair of the Policy Research and Advocacy Committee of IK, and also the vice chair of the ADR Committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justus. Yes, Engineer Grace Kagondo, I know you said your name, but as a council member also.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Once again, I am, my name is Engineer Grace Muthoni Kagondo. I am the ordinary council member and also the chair of the Capacity Building and Mentorship Committee, vice chair of the Events and Conference Committee. Thank you very much. Karibu sana to our second webinar by the CBM committee in conjunction with the PRAC. Karibuni.
Thank you very much, Engineer Grace. Engineer Doreen Kago. Engineer Marambe. Engineer Christine Ogood. And last but not the least, Engineer Linda, the CEO.
Good morning, everyone. This is Engineer Linda Otieno, the CEO for IK. Thank you for attending the webinar, and stay tuned for more of such webinars. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Engineer Linda. So members, sorry for that indulgence to introduce the council. That is the serving council of IK, and as I said, when time allows, we hope to have a session. Thank you very much, members. That is the council. Some I may have missed others, probably because they are not able to hear me calling out, but I'm sure you know them because you voted for them. Engineer Francis Gitau, allow me at the start of this session to declare a conflict of interest. I hope you don't mind. that the conflict of interest is that at one time we shared a class, and for about, is it 3 to 4 years?
Yes, Honorable President, sir. Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much. It's good to know. And I'm very happy to welcome you to IK. And I'd like to tell our members that in addition to being my classmate, you are now the infrastructure secretary at the Ministry of Infrastructure. Sorry, at the Ministry of Transport, Infrastructure, Housing and Urban Development. And of course, because of your position, you represent the PS on various boards. And you've been the chairman of the Mechanical Transport Fund from 2015. And you've also worked in various capacities, including being the chairman of Budget Committee of Infrastructure Department, chairman of Transport Sector Training Committee of National Industrial Training Authority. You're the alternate chair of the Ministerial Human Resource Committee, chairman of National Steering Committee on Review of Road Design Standards, and ISO implementer under Road Department, among other leadership positions. You've also been trained in various areas, including strategic leadership, resource management, management of labor-based road construction and maintenance program, management of road maintenance, financial monitoring and evaluation, management of corporate governance, and of course the FIDIC courses. So fellow engineers, we have within us a very senior government official. He is one of us, and you know that we make an effort to get in touch with the government. So Engineer Gitau today, allow me to share with you
our president, we can't hear you.
Sorry, you lost me. When I said a few things about you, were people hearing?
Yes, we were hearing. Yes, we were hearing that. And
when I said you are the most senior government official in our midst today, and therefore, as members, as members of IEK, we'd like to share with you a few of our concerns. I know there are people in the room who are going to address the topic that we are going to discuss today, much more qualified than myself, so I will not attempt to try to go into the topic. But just a few concerns from our members, and I know that we need to be alive to the idea that we have in government legislation what is called the 40% local content. But we struggle with this, and we would like you to assist us with the government to ensure that all infrastructure consultancy projects and even construction, the government should, in the terms of reference, should put a clause where this 40% local content is enforced. Sometimes we feel that some projects are happening and we are not able to define, to see the manifestation of the 40% local content. We also know that some of our members suffer a lot when they work for government due to the delayed payments. And if possible, and if you're able to convince the government that they should consider converting pending bills to some redeemable bonds as a way forward, because if the government doesn't have money, instead of borrowing money from the public, you could also use the money you owe people in this way. We also know that the national government and the county government sometimes struggle with the projects. We don't know whether it's because of lack of knowledge, but it is common sense that when an institution doesn't have the design and supervision capacity, these roles should go to consultants. So we urge you, because of your position, to lobby your colleagues that design and supervision of all projects be done by professional engineers. It is a heavy load for the implementing agencies if they have staff to be the designers and also the supervisors. We have agencies like KERA who have a lot of projects, and you probably have one regional director who is supervising 60 or even 100 projects in several regions. This is not tenable, and we need to ensure that there is value for money, that work is done, and the quality of the engineering projects, infrastructure projects is maintained. And the only way to assure this quality, Francis, is to ensure that works are designed in full, documented, and supervised. We also urge the government to ensure that the terms of reference for all infrastructure projects reserve only senior management to foreign consultants. And this should only be done where the Engineers Board of Kenya has confirmed that there is no such local capacity. We also have challenges with our students who are graduating from universities in terms of internship positions. The issue of having an intern for 1 year doesn't make a lot of economic sense, because after that 1 year, the intern loses that place and it's very hard for them to get another training opportunity. We urge you to help us with your colleagues and government to ensure that all internship positions in infrastructure projects are minimum 3 years. And there should be an item in bill number 1 where payment for these interns is covered so that they are able to stay on projects for a minimum of 3 years. And when they finish their internship period, they are able to transition to professional engineers. That way we shall be able to create the labor force that the country needs to achieve the Big 4 agenda and finally Vision 2030. I've already talked about the need to enhance and help our road authorities to outsource design and supervision works. But we also urge government to move with speed to ensure that all the local authorities, the boards, are properly constituted and the chairs are in place. We know for now, we don't have a substantive chair for KERA. And I'm sure Engineer Gitao, these a few items are well in your, and you are able to look after it. And we urge you, since you are in that position you are the best person who understands the issues.
Let me make my very brief remarks. I have noted the many concerns that have been raised by our president. I also want to declare the conflict of interest that the president was my classmate and a very able and very hardworking gentleman, and I'm very proud that he is our president today. I have heard about issues about 40%, the delayed payments, the government projects, and the weak link in project management, especially as you have mentioned in KERA. I want to put those sentiments aside. I know we'll have a time with the president where we shall be able to look at each and every one of these issues and work around them as engineers. I am proud to be part of this fraternity. In this session, we have very senior engineers, some of them who are our even teachers. They are our teachers, they are astute professionals and experts by their own right in this profession. And we accept our respects from the government. Just as a matter of opening this webinar, just to mention that the street design manual is a piece of work that will transform the urban street design, and it is bringing to the fore the need of having equity and equality in the sharing of public transport infrastructure, especially in the urban areas, and optimizing public investment in a way that also supplements the land use around urban areas. So us as engineers, the planners, and all professionals related to and involved in urban design, this is a piece of work that will help us standardize and systematize the process of the project preparation of urban streets, and also give us a platform upon which to implement the citizen-friendly infrastructure in the urban areas with a focus on sustainable mobility. And I happen to double up as the Director General for the Nairobi Metropolitan Area Transport Authority. And in this particular authority, we will be the custodians of the urban mobility plans. And in that, we will be happy to adapt this design approach for the street design that is giving preference and also balancing the availability of mobility space in our urban environment. I don't want to speak a lot. You know Itdp, our Institute for Transport and Development Policy, very close partners with government. IEK is a great pillar for the government, because it is from you that we derive the expertise, and you are the reservoir of knowledge in terms of managing the space. So I want to welcome all of you to this webinar, and our president, honorable president, thank you very much for this great organization of bringing on board so many of our colleagues. And I take this opportunity to say we are in our learning process, all of us as a team, and you will provide the peer review, and we shall listen to you and add value where you will have advised us or given us a comment. So with those many remarks, I want to declare this webinar officially open. Asanteni sana.
Thank you very much, Engineer Francis Gitau, for those great remarks. I think we can now proceed with the street design manual. So I invite Njeri Mburu to proceed with her presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Engineer Gitau, thank you very much for finding time to be with us and open this session. Today, we are going to take you through this presentation on street design manual for urban areas in Kenya. I'm going to take you through the introduction and then I'll invite our Africa Director, Chris Cost, to take us through part of the presentation, and then Gitau will take us through another section of the presentation. So let me start with a brief introduction of Itdp. Itdp is a non-governmental organization. We are working throughout the world, from China, Jakarta, Indonesia, India. We are here in Nairobi, we're in New York, Washington, where our headquarters is located. We're also in Mexico. We also have offices in Brazil and Argentina. So our work is to promote sustainable transport. That is walking, cycling, public transport, means of transport that do not impact on the environment and are friendly to everybody. The street design manual was prepared by Itdp for the Ministry of Transport, Infrastructure and Urban Development. It is supported by Global Road Safety Facility and International Climate Initiative. We started this work way back in early 2018, and we have been working closely with the ministry and all the key stakeholders. And this webinar is part of the stakeholder engagement. Engineers being the key users, the people who are going to be the key users of this street design manual. It was very necessary that we engage you at some point. So the consultation process, we started with the street design workshop with Nairobi in 2019 with Nairobi City Government. In March 2019, we have presented to Kenya, Kura. We also had a very big workshop before COVID in Kenya School of Monetary Studies, where we had a lot of organizations represented. including even counties. I remember we had very far people who had come from very far to attend the workshop. We have presented to Namata also, Kenha Metropolitan Development Authority. Then we have also had a webinar with Mombasa County recently in June. And now this one. So we continue to have these engagements. We continue to ask for your input, for your comments, for your questions, so that we make a document which is belongs to all of us and which we are going to make best use of. So why do we need the street design manual? You'll find that as you move around in our cities, there are things that will make you see that there's a gap somewhere. Let me start by looking at how our urban people travel. JICA studies 2014 indicate that 40% of Nairobi population walk on a daily basis, and 41% use public transport. Only 13% of the Nairobi population use cars. If you look at Mombasa, we find that 45% of the people living in Mombasa city walk on a daily basis, and 36% are using public transport. 11% are using bodabodas, and only 3% are using private cars. And looking at Kisumu, we find that 53%, a huge number of people, 53% are walking on a daily basis, and only 6% are using their cars. The rest, we have 13% who are using public transport and other means of public transport like tuk-tuks, cycle bodabodas. So you can see generally, most of our people use public transport and walking. Looking at Nairobi and Mombasa, we have over 80% of our people using public transport and walking. But when it comes to the situation on the ground, we find that most of the times our roads, our investments on our roads focus mainly on constructing the pavement for the cars, and often we have nowhere for people to walk. There are no facilities even for public transport most of the time. If you look at that photo, you'll find that there is a space for people, for vehicle movement. There is that the paved road, the carriageway. Often there will be parking. You'll find that parking is provided for, but most of the times, no investments go into providing facilities for walking, no facilities for cycling, no spaces for people to meet, and no organized street vending. In other words, we have made our streets for cars and not for people. And these are some of the things that we really need to start looking into and changing. If you look at that photo, you'll find that the cars are very well taken care of. There's a very nice carriageway. But when you look at where the people have to try and maneuver and find their way. The lady there is almost falling into the river. It's actually a very pathetic situation. And we need to change. We really need to change some of these things. Look at that situation there. Look at the person who is walking with a little child. They have to walk on the carriageway because really there is nowhere for people to walk. Here there is a footpath, there is a cycle track, but when you look at the cycle track and the footpath, they're not continuous. They end up in a drain, and it's very difficult for people to cross the drain. I can see Good Samaritan has put a small footbridge there across the stormwater drain to enable people to cross. So these are some of the things that indicate that there is need for a street design manual so that we design the infrastructure which provides all the facilities for all the road users. Another design here, this is a cycle track, but you can see there is a curb somewhere. And if you're cycling on the cycle track, it's very difficult to make your way through the curb, the protruding curb. And you find that there is all sorts of debris which is accumulating there because the flood water, the water runoff from the carriageway is passing through the NMT, the cycle track, towards the drain. So this kind of situation, these are the situations that we need to improve, to change, so that our people are more comfortable when they are using the NMTs. If you look at that photo, this is Kisumu. This is Nairobi Road in Kisumu. The lanes, the road is very, very wide. You can see it's very difficult for those children to cross the road. It's very dangerous. This is the way we design most of our highways, very wide lanes, very wide roads, and no facilities for crossing for pedestrians. It makes it very unsafe for anybody who is walking to make their way across our highways. Another situation is the way our roads are congested. Nairobi is becoming famous for traffic congestion. And this is not good. It's not good for our economy. I understand a study was done in 2015, and it established that we are losing over almost 200 billion every year to traffic congestion. It's a very serious situation. But what has led to this? You find that whenever we find ourselves in such a situation, we keep widening our roads. And what is happening is that when we widen our roads, we attract more cars and we end up in worse traffic. And another thing that is happening is our public transport is held up in traffic congestion. And that makes it very difficult to transport our people. So we need to have some sort of a paradigm shift where we stop always thinking of how we are going to provide more space for cars to a situation where we start reducing the demand for road space by changing the way our people move. We need to focus on moving people and not moving cars. If we can be able to use the space which is available to move more people, then we will end up with a better situation than this. So widening roads will will improve the situation for a short time, but it will end up attracting more cars, and we end up with a worse traffic congestion, pollution, loss of man hours, and we just away the visitors, the tourists, and anybody who wishes to invest in our city. So we need to deal with this kind of situation in an urgent manner. So this is the way we have been doing our streets, been designing our streets. We tend to focus so much on the car. We want the cars to move very fast and to have as much space as possible. And while we're doing that, we tend to neglect the rest of the road users, the public transport, the people who are walking, the people who are cycling. And we end up in a very difficult situation where nobody can move. We need to change to a situation where all the road users are important, where we start thinking of that over 80% of our people who are using public transport, who are walking, who are cycling, and we start providing for them on our roads. And it is happening in other cities in Africa. This is Dar es Salaam. This is the Brt Corridor in Dar es Salaam, Morogoro Road. You find that the road space is shared between all the road users, starting with the pedestrians. Pedestrians have their wide walkways, very nice, very safe. We have the cyclists, they have their space there. We have dedicated lanes for public transport to move the masses, to move a lot of people efficiently and in a fast way. And finally, you have the space for the mixed traffic. So need to start shifting towards providing for everybody. And if we look at how cities are responding to COVID situation, you find that it's becoming, the situation is making it difficult for more people to move in public transport because of social distancing. And cities do not want a situation where people start using their cars because they do not want to use public transport. So most cities have started having pop-up bike lanes. We have Bali 22 kilometers, Bogota with 76 kilometers, and so on. And you start with temporary bike lanes, and you can convert these bike lanes into permanent bike lanes, so that you encourage more people to use the active modes of transport rather than shifting from public transport to their private cars. And I think we should borrow from these cities. We should, urban areas should start thinking of how we can create or start pop-up bike lanes and encourage more people to use to cycle rather than using their cars. Now, looking at highways versus urban streets, what is a highway and what is an urban street? So that photo on your left looks at a highway in Kisumu. And you can see the situation is such that the design focuses on uninterrupted vehicle movement, high speeds of vehicles. Often we have pedestrian footbridges, which are supposed to allow fast movement of vehicles, no provision for public transport, and no provision for NMT, or people who are walking, people who are cycling. But the situation is such that you end up with everybody on the carriageway, a very chaotic situation, and everybody gets inconvenienced, and there are serious safety issues, especially for pedestrians. On the other hand, if we look at a well-designed, a complete street design, an urban street, ideally, we should have vehicle movement, mixed traffic, moving at a reasonable speed for safety of everybody else who is using the road. We need safe crossings for the pedestrians. We need dedicated lanes where possible, dedicated lanes, and especially for the main corridors. We should dedicate some lanes for public transport so that we can be able to move as many people as possible through the same space. And separate space, you can see some nice walkways, wide walkways, some nice cycle tracks. So everybody has their space and there's order, and it is safe to be in that space. So the street design manual, I'll go through quickly through the contents. We have 8 chapters in the street design manual. We start with the introduction, where we give some background information, some literature review. We also look at the existing policies, the guiding principles. We also look at, in chapter 2, we look at the complete street design principles. We have given 5 principles. We are going to go through them. In chapter 3, we are looking at the priority networks. Chapter 4 looks at street elements. We have identified 16 street elements that should be included in a complete street design. We have also looked at the various street templates that can be used for our roads, for the various right-of-ways. We have looked at the intersection designs in chapter 6. In chapter 7, we have given the design manual outlines the design process for a street. And finally, chapter 8 talks about the design checklist, a quick checklist to ensure that the design meets the street design manual standards. So I will go through chapter 1 on introduction. We have our laws. The Constitution of Kenya is very clear on the right to freedom of movement under Article 39, 1. Article 42 is clear on the right to clean and healthy environment. And whenever we are designing the roads, we must be alive to these provisions of the Constitution of Kenya, the supreme law. It also talks about public officers being mandated to address the needs of the vulnerable citizens, the women, the elderly, the children, the persons with disabilities. So our law, our Constitution of Kenya is very clear and supports the kind of things that are provided for in the street design manual for urban areas in Kenya. There is the integrated national transport policy for Kenya. The national transport policy recognizes the inadequate, overcrowded, inefficient, and unreliable public transport. For a long time, the situation has been the same, and it needs to start changing. The heavy traffic congestion, the competition for limited road space, and it promotes restricted access for private cars. We need to reduce the number of private cars in our urban areas. It is indeed the private cars which are causing the traffic congestion because they are the most inefficient modes of transport and they are polluting our environment. When the policy again talks about road pricing to reduce the number of private cars. There is also the differentiated parking. It talks about all these things and really enforces or discusses the ways that we can start to address congestion in our urban areas. It also highlights the pedestrian walkways, the need for pedestrian walkways to improve road safety. We have the Traffic Act, the latest version 2015. Section 42 talks about maximum speed limit of 50 kilometers per hour in urban areas. If you happen to be on Wayaki Way, near Kempinski, the vehicles there move at speeds over 100 kilometers per hour. I know it because our offices used to be there before COVID. Now, this situation is very dangerous for anybody who is not driving. It creates a very dangerous situation for people walking, for people cycling. The Traffic Act is very clear that in the urban areas, the maximum speed should be 50 kilometers per hour to improve safety. Section 42.3a talks about speed control on urban roads next to educational institutions, next to schools. Very important. We have our children going to school, walking to school. We need to make the situation safe for them so that they can be able to walk freely and safely to school and back. We have section 42.3a, which talks about speed control features in low speed zones, especially like where you have schools, hospitals, and any other built up area. Very important. And 45A, which prohibits driving on pedestrian walkways. There's also the National Climate Change Action Plan, policy document on the climate change. It's very clear, this document is very clear that we need to start moving to mass transit to be able to move our people in a more efficient manner. And it has given a target of 70 kilometers in all the 5 corridors, Brt corridors in Nairobi. And it gives a target of 150 kilometers of NMT in urban areas in Kenya. It also talks about electric and hybrid buses to reduce pollution, and the need for planning regulations to encourage compact land use and reduced provision for parking near mass transit. So all these things are in our policy documents. And I think we need to really start implementing what we have put in our policies. I'll discuss the complete street design principles. There are 5 principles. And after this, I'll hand over to our Africa Director to continue. Top on the principles that guide the street design manual for urban areas in Kenya is road safety. And indeed, we need to seriously think of road safety in Kenya because it's very serious. We find that when I look at the NTSA data, in 2019, 3,572 people lost their lives on our roads by December 2019. In 2018, 3,151 people lost their lives on our roads, which means the number seems to be increasing. This is very serious. And we find that more than 50% of the people who are losing their lives on our roads are pedestrians. So it has been established that the impact or the chance of a person losing their life due to an impact after being hit by a car increases with the increase in speed of the vehicle. And below 30 kilometers per hour, if that vehicle hits a pedestrian, chances of surviving are high. But above 50 kilometers per hour, you find that most of the times the victim will die. The higher the speed, the chances of the person, the pedestrian, dying out of the impact. You also find that when you're driving, the lower the speed, if you're driving below 15 kilometers per hour, you can see a lot. Your field of vision is very wide, and you can be able to see a lot. You can be able to predict what the pedestrians or any other road users are doing. And it's possible to stop in a very short time and distance and be able to prevent an accident. But as the speed increases, your field of vision decreases, and it's difficult for you to see some of the activities that are happening on the road. It's also difficult for you to stop the vehicle, and chances of you causing an accident become higher and higher as the speed increases. So what we are saying is that the impact and the chance of causing an accident increase with increasing speed. So what does that tell us? That we must control the speeds in our cities. For the small streets, the local streets within the urban areas, what we call the shared streets, we must reduce the speeds significantly to less than 15 kilometers per hour so that all the road users are safe. When it comes to the local and collector streets, you will find that the vehicles will be moving at a higher speed, 30 kilometers or even higher. There is need to start separating the NMT users. So at this speed, you can have the cyclists moving with the mixed traffic, but you need now to separate the pedestrians. So at that 30 kilometers per hour, separate the pedestrians from the mixed traffic, but you can still have the cyclists in the mixed traffic. But when you get to speeds of 50 kilometers per hour and higher in the major streets, it's very key that we completely separate the NMT users from the mixed traffic for their safety. The second principle the second underlying principle for the street design manual is efficient use of road space. Whatever road space we have now is limited, is very limited. And we cannot keep increasing the road space. It has been tried elsewhere, just increasing the road space for cars, but it does not work. We need to change so that we design our roads for maximum or optimal usage of the space which is available. And that is by using high capacity, efficient public transport, dedicated bus lanes, so that we can move as many people as possible within the shortest time possible. So we need to agree that improving mobility is not necessarily increasing the number of cars or the movement of cars, but increasing the number of people that we can be able to move in a particular space within a certain particular time. And using the dedicated bus lanes will do the trick. You can see that space, which if we fill it with cars, we can only move 3,000 people. But the same space, if we put dedicated bus lanes, we can be able to move 45,000 people per hour per direction. The third principle is universal access. We need to take into consideration, and our constitution is very clear on that. We need to take care of everybody. We need to accommodate people living with disability. And disability does not only mean you are on a wheelchair or you cannot see, no. Even an old person is to some extent disabled. A sick person is disabled to some extent. A child, an expectant mother. All these people must be taken care of in our designs. And persons with disabilities are entitled to reasonable access in places and transport services. So infrastructure, the vehicles that are being used, especially for public transport, must provide for people with disabilities. We must also consider gender. This is our fourth principle, the fourth principle. Somebody might ask, why gender? Yes, indeed, women and men do not travel the same way. If you look at the way, if you just stand somewhere and look at the way women are moving around and the way men are moving around, it's completely different. First of all, women will tend to be carrying luggage. Maybe they have bought, they have done some shopping, vegetable sport. Often you'll find a woman will be carrying a child, or she'll be walking with children. Most of the time, you'll find an expectant mother. Also, the issue of security is different for men and for women. Women need safe places to walk. And what you'll find that if a street is safe for women, for girls, then it is safe for everybody. So we need to make our streets safe and user-friendly for everybody, and especially for the weaker gender, the women, the girls. And we also need to encourage like our women also to cycle and to use public transport. In Kisumu, we some time back we did a household survey, and out of the survey, we established that about 60% of the women walk and 44% of the men walk. So what we are saying is that more women walk than men. The percentage of the women who are walking are more. Most likely men can cycle, men have other options. So when we are designing these roads, let us remember that. The fifth principle is the model hierarchy, that we must rank the modes, the various modes. And we have ranked pedestrians top, then come next is cyclists, public transport, freight, moving cars, and finally parked cars. So when we are designing our roads, we should consider the pedestrians, give them top priority, followed by cyclists, followed by public transport. Why should we do this? One of the reasons is that walking is the basic mode of transport. It's free, it's completely free, it's affordable to everybody. It's the mode for the least privileged. And it does not pollute our environment. Cycling also is very friendly to our environment. And public transport also is a very efficient mode of transport. So as we design the roads, let us give priorities to the sustainable modes of transport, walking, cycling, and public transport. Thank you very much. I'll invite Chris Cost to present the next chapter on priority.
Yes, Chris, we are waiting for you.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's very good to be with you today. I'll share my screen now, and we can continue with chapter 3. So this next chapter, building on the principles that Engineer and Jerry talked about, goes over what we're calling the priority networks. And the idea here is that when we're designing an individual street, we can't just design that segment in isolation. We need to design it as part of the larger street network in the city, okay? And traditionally, the approach to this was that, streets were put into these categories like arterials, subarterials, collectors, and local streets. And the idea was that there was a zero-sum trade-off between mobility and land access. And that there would generally be higher speeds, higher car volumes on the larger streets. We follow a different approach in Sdmuak because the reality is that all of our urban streets have multiple users, right? So from small streets to very large streets in Kenyan cities, we have pedestrians, we have cyclists, we have public transport, we have matatu stages and stops, and we have motorized traffic. And so we need to think about how the street that we're designing interacts with all of these networks and make sure that it satisfies the various requirements of the users. Okay, so the manual goes through the different networks that need to be accommodated. So first, the pedestrian network. The important points here are that the pedestrian network needs to have a fine grain, so we need to make sure, for instance, if we're designing a major street, that it doesn't sever the pedestrian network, that it has frequent crossings where there's demand for people to cross, and that the intersections and crossings are aligned with the street network in the surrounding area, okay? We also need to think about the cycling network. This is especially important because cycling, if you just build a kilometer of cycle track here and there, it won't really work. We need to have a complete network of cycle facilities if we want people to be able to cycle safely in our cities. So this is an example of such a network plan from the mobility plan Kisumu. And so the idea is that if your city has adopted a cycle network plan, you need to make sure that the street that you're designing, if it's on this network, that it actually includes a cycle track, okay? And then we get to public transport. So the public transport's been mapped very well in Nairobi, also in Kisumu and Mombasa. So we know where the matatu routes are operating. We know where the stages are located. And so if you're designing a street on, that's part of this matatu network, we need to make sure that we include bus stops, bus shelters, terminals where required. We can't just ignore the public transport and pretend that it doesn't exist, okay? And then there's bus rapid transit, right? So for Nairobi, we have the 2014 harmonization plan that was adopted by the ministry, and then these BRT corridors were later declared through the legal notice 16 last year. So we know where the BRT it needs to come, and so we need to make sure when we're designing the streets on the BRT network that they include adequate facilities for BRT. And then finally, let me just mention before I go on to the street elements, we also need to talk about the motorized transport network, how are we providing mobility for cars? But the point here is that we want to provide safe access without compromising the mobility of other road users. So that's how motor vehicles will come in. So then the next chapter, chapter 4, talks about the street elements. And it gives specific design standards for these elements. It gives the dimensions that we require. And I just clarify that this manual is focusing on geometric design of urban streets, because we have other manuals in the manual series that talk about pavement, materials, thickness, and things like that. So the point of what we're describing here is how we should handle the geometric design. Okay, so as my colleague engineer Jerry mentioned, we have 16 street elements. And what we're trying to show is how each of these has specific standards, but then we also need to know how they come together in a coherent street design. So let's get into some of the specific elements and look at some of the standards that are included in the manual. So starting with footpaths, this is the fundamental element of our streets. We need to design, start designing our footpaths according to the zone system. And so that means having adequate clear space for walking, at least 2 meters, and then having the furniture and light poles and trees and things like that concentrated into the furniture zone. So a lot of times we ignore the need for these zones, and then it results in people walking in the carriageway. Okay, so here's a good example of that from downtown Nairobi, where you have a well-organized furniture zone, you have enough clear space for walking, and it's accessible. So someone in a wheelchair is actually able to use the street. And of course, that 2 meter is a minimum. The width needs to increase according to the pedestrian volume. And so you can have much wider pedestrian zones like this, the case on Mama Ngina Street in Nairobi. And again, in this one, you can see the good alignment of the furniture and having a tree line, and conversations are happening in that zone while people still have plenty of space to walk. Okay. Then the manual also talks about universal access. So a lot of times we're not building accessibility into our footpaths. So we have a lot of steps, like some of the examples that you saw earlier in the presentation. And so it's urgent that we start incorporating this in our designs. So the manual talks about things like the footpath height, the bollard spacing, ramp slopes, and so on, how to handle property entrances so that the walkways are not interrupted whenever you have a property entrance, things like that. So, and a point to make here is that the universal access is a function not only of the geometry and the dimensions, but also the construction quality. And I saw that someone mentioned in the comment box that we need to have better construction quality because otherwise we won't be able to achieve this. And this is a case from Dar es Salaam where you can see the very nice finishing, the gradual ramp slope, the good interface between the different materials, the asphalt of the carriageway and also the blocks of the footpath. Okay, so that's footpath design. Then we get to crossings. This is another key element. So in many of our streets, we're just not including crossings. And so that results in the kind of situation you see here. It's very dangerous for the pedestrians, and it leads to unpredictability for the motor vehicle users because they don't know where people are going to cross. And what a thing that we need to consider throughout the design of urban streets is human behavior. We need to really acknowledge human behavior and stop trying to pretend that we can design streets just based on formulas without considering how people actually move in our cities. And with pedestrian crossings, one of the key points is that if we don't have any good crossing, then people will cross anywhere, right? And so we can't blame the pedestrians for this behavior because we haven't given any good place for them to cross, right? So let's start providing some crossings and then we'll see people start to use them, right? Now, usually the response we get is, oh, let's just build a footbridge, okay? There are a lot of issues with footbridges. They increase the walking time and distance. They're not accessible to people with disabilities. Even if you build a ramp, it's not easy for someone with a disability or someone who's using a mobility assistive device to get over this bridge, right? They're often dangerous. So a lot of people in Nairobi avoid the bridges because there's a site for muggings. And they often obstruct the footpath and cycle track. And you can see in this case on Thika Road how that's happened. And you might just say, oh, well, this was just a fluke. Maybe there was just a mistake made in this case. But if we look across our cities, there are examples in Mombasa and Nairobi. This keeps happening over and over again. So these footbridges are really not compatible with a good NMT environment. And they make life difficult for the road users. They're not really pedestrian infrastructure. They're just meant to speed up car movement. And if we want to give access to all users, we really need to consider the approach to this and use footbridges very sparingly and only on cases where we do have a true limited access highway, but not on all urban streets. Okay, so how do we design a good crossing? Okay, here's an example, having a tabletop crossing. The idea here is to raise the crossing to the level of the walkway so that there are no level differences, and then ensure that there's a steep enough ramp slope, which usually means about 1 to 10, that actually slows down the vehicles, okay? So here's an example of how the tabletop crossings have been incorporated along the Brt corridors in Dar es Salaam, provides safe access, it slows down the vehicles. And Dar has seen a real change in the driving culture, okay? So vehicles actually stop for pedestrians now at these crossings, which is something that you'd be hard pressed to find in any Kenyan city, right? And so we need to start designing good crossings and then we can start to see the road user behavior also change on our streets. We were really excited to see this new crossing on Gong Road. There are a couple of these that have been built recently. This is the tabletop in the hospitals area in Upper Hill. This is great. Like, let's build more of these. because this slows down the vehicles. You see people start to, before people would cross anywhere at this location, now people are starting to use the designated crossing, and it's a lot safer. So let's start reproducing that. Then we get to cycling. There's huge potential for cycling. Engineer Jerry showed the slide of how a lot of cities are making cycling part of the COVID-19 response. And we can do that in Kenya too. We have in a city like Nairobi, we have amazing weather. It's perfect for cycling, but we just don't have the infrastructure. And we've talked to so many people over the years who wish that they could cycle, but they're simply afraid of doing it, right? And if we want to address the gender inequities that we talked about earlier, we need to have good cycle tracks. So the manual gives some of the standards for cycle track design. A key one is that cycle tracks need to be raised above the carriageway. And let's see why that's the case. Here's another shot of the cycle lane on Outer Ring Road. You can see, again, it's because it was at the lowest point in the cross section, it's accumulating all this dirt and rubble and debris, right? And so our cyclists are out in the carriageway. So we need to raise the cycle tracks above the drainage. Let's make sure that they don't get inundated with this kind of mess, right? So that's one example. They need to be continuous, so here our cycle track has ended at the bridge, and so the cyclists are moving into the carriageway to cross the railway line. So let's make sure that the cycle tracks are continuous. And then there are a lot of interdependencies between these elements, as I mentioned. So if you don't have a good footpath, your cycle track's not going to work either. And this is what we see along Wangari Maathai Road at the beginning of Thika Road, where the footpath is either too narrow or it's too high or it's not continuous. And so everyone's walking in the cycle track. So we need to really clean up our act on the footpath design if we want the cycle tracks to work well. We also need to choose the right materials. So paver blocks don't work. They're too bumpy. They settle unevenly. So you end up with a really rough riding surface. So we need to use a smooth material. Here's an example of a cycle track that would meet the standards. It's 2 meters wide. It's raised above the carriageway. It has enough separation that people can feel comfortable riding. And it has a wide enough footpath next to it that people don't need to walk in the cycle track. So those are some of the key standards to start taking into account. And as someone mentioned in the comments, I think, the Gong Road Phase 2 has a much better cycle lane design. This is vastly improved compared to Phase 1. It's wider, it's smooth, relatively smooth. It's the right material, it's not in paver blocks. So let's do more of this, right? The only thing on this corridor is that sometimes the footpath is too narrow. So during the peak hour, pedestrians spill over into the cycle track. But this is definitely a move in the right direction, and we should try to follow this type of design in many more of our streets. Okay, and the other thing is that we can create protected cycle lanes very quickly. If we, in cases where we have extra carriageway space, we don't have to do the capital intensive design that I just showed from Gong Road. All it takes is a couple of planter boxes or bollards to physically demarcate the space for the cycle lane. And this is what Kisumu has done as part of the Kisumu Triangle project. And unfortunately, I understand that the city of Kisumu has been under a lot of pressure to remove this cycle track. And we need to think about, within the engineering fraternity, like how can we encourage these kinds of designs rather than discouraging them, and make sure that we can get protected bike lanes like this on many more of our streets. Okay, so that's cycling. Now let me talk about BRT. So as many of you may know, there is the Brt Design Framework that NAMATA adopted in early 2018. So in the Sdmuak, we don't attempt to give all of the BRT design guidelines. If you want the details, the formulas, you can go into the Brt Design Framework, but we try to touch some of the highlights. So let me talk about a few of those. One is that BRT is a system, so it's much more than just bus lanes. We need to have the high quality stations, the high capacity buses, and good NMT facilities integrated with the BRT. And that includes accessible crossings. And we need to ensure that it's actually a high capacity, high quality system. You know, it's not just an old vehicle running in the lane, okay? And you know, I was seeing a lot of discussion in the chat box about the existing road right-of-way being constrained. Right-of-way is not the limiting factor with BRT. It's purely a matter of political will. So we can have BRT cross sections on narrow streets. Here's an example from Morgo Road in Dar es Salaam, where you have a street where all the cars were removed, the parking was removed, and now the priority is given to public transport and NMT. So we can definitely, you know, retrofit even our narrow streets with new designs. And we try to give examples throughout the manual of how this can be done through creative cross sections, okay? So the chapter, the Sdmuak BRT section gives you know, some examples of BRT cross sections, how it can be incorporated, and it points out that the infrastructure really needs to be sized according to demand, okay? And there are formulas that you can use to figure this out, and this is covered in, you know, in good detail in the Brt Design Framework. And I'll just give a case study of how this can be done. You know, how we can walk through that process. So for BRT line 2 on Thika Road, we worked with NMATA to collect a lot of data about the existing public transport trips on the corridor. And we found that there's very high demand, you know, up to 27,000 ppHPD. And so we used that to come up with a service plan and to identify where the BRT services should operate, you know, where they should extend off the BRT corridors, and what kind of demand you would have on such a system. And then finally, based on that, we were able to come up with the station sizing. So we know which stations need to have 1 substop, 2 substops, 3 substops, and so on. And so this shows how you can, you know, go from the public transport data collection to the final infrastructure design to inform the way we build the station and corridors on the street. So that's for BRT. We also have the regular bus stops and matatu stages. And so the manual, you know, is really clear that it's not just on BRT that you need to think about this, but all the regular bus stops need proper facilities. We need to have proper shelters with you know, protection from the elements, from rain and sun protection. We need to have lighting at night. And these elements need to be integrated with the design of the footpath and bike lane, because oftentimes we just plop the bus shelter down in the middle of the footpath, but it blocks the pedestrians too. So let's get the design standards clear. You know, here's an example of a bus stop that has a bus bay, but there's no shelter, no waiting area. So we need to add that to our cross sections. Here's an example again with the bus bay, but there's no way to cross over the open drain. So we need to have accessible bus stops that, you know, where people can actually get to the matatus without having to leap for it. And then looking at the interrelationship. So if you have a cycle track, making sure that it's run behind the bus stop so that people don't run into this conflict. And this is something that, you know, again, was an issue with Gong Road phase 1, but with phase 2, it was corrected. And now the cycle tracks run behind the bus stops. So that's how we can incorporate good facilities for public transport on all of our streets. Then the manual gets to landscaping. You know, oftentimes we think of landscaping as just an aesthetic component, but it really has a functional role in providing shade for pedestrians. And that's especially important in the very warm climates in Kenya. So especially in cities like Mombasa, we need to have good shade to make it comfortable for people to walk and cycle and use public transport. Now, the problem we have today is usually whenever we start a street design project, we cut all the trees, okay? And that's what happened here. You can see the before and after from Gong Road. And this happened in spite of the fact that most of these trees were outside the construction area, right? So the roadway could have been built without having to cut all these trees. So let's see how we can preserve the existing trees. And then we don't have to take, years and decades for our trees to mature and actually provide shade on our streets. Here's another example from Kisumu with the new Kisumu Triangle project, where all the existing trees were preserved and incorporated in the footpath design. So it required some customization, going onto the site and looking at where the trees are, figuring out how to align the light poles and other elements so that they were compatible with these existing trees. But I think the result is really amazing. And, and so from day one, this corridor offers a very comfortable place for people to walk. Okay. And we can do this even when we're bringing in heavy infrastructure. So here's the BRT Line 1 corridor in Mexico City, where these were the existing trees that were there before the BRT was built. And you can see how even as the rigid pavement was inserted, that all the trees were preserved along the corridor. So let's see how we can be a bit more creative about the designs and get the trees into our topo drawings and make sure that they're part of the final detailed designs. Then the manual gives some guidelines for service lanes. So we need to make sure that we design service lanes not just as another carriageway, not just as another set of express lanes, but actually to provide the local access. So having reasonable lane widths. So generally 6 meters would be sufficient for 2 lanes. And we can also have some 1-lane service lanes. That works too. And we need to make sure that we include the traffic calming. So you can see this example from Kisumu on the bypass, where the community built this do-it-yourself traffic calming to make it safe for kids to cross. But why don't we design our service lanes to be safe from the start by including the traffic calming in the designs? Then the service lanes will be safe for everyone to use. And then they'll also be safe for, they could also start to function as spaces for walking and cycling if we can get the safety elements right. Okay. Then street lighting. I saw a lot of comments about street lighting. It's critical that we do a better job of the lighting. This is important for security, especially for women commuters. It's important for supporting the 24-hour economy in Kenyan cities. And we can do much better on the lighting. We also need to think about having pedestrian scale lighting. So the manual gives some examples of that, some of the standards for pedestrian lighting, so that we're not just lighting the car lanes, but we're also making sure that the pedestrian cycle lanes are safe and secure. The manual also gives some standards for street furniture. Streets are more than just conduits for traffic. They're social gathering spaces. They're hubs of economic activity, and we can have much more creative designs with our street furniture, incorporating benches and other elements to facilitate the use of the streets. Okay, and you can see that on many of our streets in central Nairobi. I mean, people really love these spaces, and they enjoy spending time. And especially in the time of COVID, when people need better outdoor space, it's important that we think about good street designs and with adequate furniture for people to spend time outdoors. Okay, drainage, another critical element. We've tried to stress in the manual that drainage needs to be compatible with the other elements, right? So we need to stop building the footpaths with drainage slots, like you can see at the lower left. We need to make sure that the covers are adequately secured, and they should really blend into the footpath. On the example to the right, you can't even tell that there's a drain there, but actually the outer row of blocks are drain covers, but they're built to a much different standard than the drain covers in the middle example. And so they actually function as an accessible footpath, and we can make sure that we do that on more of our streets. And then underground utilities, there are a couple of things to mention here. One is that we need to incorporate dedicated space for the underground utilities, like many people have mentioned in the comments already. That means installing these ducts so that you don't have to tear up the street every time you need to lay a new line. And then we also need to make sure that we avoid surfacing our utilities in a way that blocks the footpath, like this example in the upper left. So the manual gives some guidelines on that and some examples of how we can align the utility boxes so they're not blocking the walkways. So let's make sure that utilities are integrated and that can be part of a holistic design. So those are the 16 elements. And at this point, I can hand it over to my colleague, Gitao, to talk about how these elements come together in the street cross sections. Thanks.
Okay, I'll take you through the next chapter and let me share my presentation in a few. Okay, I hope you can see my screen from your side. Okay, I'll get you through the next chapter. That is on the street templates, and this chapter has provided a combination of how it shows how the various street elements that have been discussed by Chris can be combined to provide varying degrees of mobility in the urban context. And the templates are provided in varying, depending on the increasing right of way from 6 meters, 9, 12, all the way to 60 meters. And they show how you can combine all the 16 street elements to provide a good degree of mobility in the urban context. Then it's worth noting that, in some of the templates, you've provided more than one cross-section. That is in case where you find that the street cross-section changes. For example, in the case of the Brt corridors, we've provided templates which have got more than one cross-section. Then the templates are provided in a plan view. There's a plan view and also a cross-section. And this is just a guide to show you how you can combine your elements and have good mobility in your urban areas. Starting with a very narrow streets, we have the 6 meters and 9 meters. These streets these act as a shared space where we don't expect the speeds to be quite high. And when you're designing for these streets, for example, with the 6 and 9 meters, you can be able to combine to have the motorized traffic and the NMT users sharing the same space.
Hi, Gitao, sorry, let me interrupt you for just a bit. We see the manual itself, but not your slides. So can you just update the sharing?
Oh, sorry.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, sorry for that. Can you see the templates now? Oh, so hi, can you see the templates now, my presentation?
Yes, I can see the presentation.
Okay, so I was talking about the very narrow street, the 6 and 9 meters. These ones can be used as shared space where the motorized traffic and the non-motorized traffic can share the same space because the speeds are quite low. You expect speeds of up to about 15 kilometers.
Hi, Gitao, I think we lost your audio.
Oh, he lost his connection, he's reconnecting.
Good morning, members. Once again, as Gitau tries to get himself reconnected, I just wanted to propose, if you saw our program, we had included a break after this presentation before the Q&A session. But I wanted to propose that in the interest of time, we just proceed straight to the Q&A session after this presentation so that we can wind up as soon as possible. Thank you.
Sorry for that interruption. There was an issue with the connection, but now I'm back. Okay. So going on to the next template, we have on wider streets, we have the 80 meters right of way. And you can see it's possible to combine all the elements on this corridor. One of the options is to have the carriageway with your motorized traffic sharing the same space. You can see that the cyclists and the motorized traffic are sharing the same space, but there is a need to provide the traffic calming measures in the form of tabletop crossings. Another option would be to have a corridor which has made provisions for a BRT only. This has been achieved in some corridors in Dar es Salaam, where you have the BRT passing the median, and there is wide provision for your footpaths on the extreme edges. Moving on to wider right of ways, you can see at the 30 meter right of way, we always say that when designing our roads, we feel like we need to acquire more land to make provisions for the BRT. But it's not always the case. This shows a basic BRT corridor, and it's an example of most of the streets in Mombasa, where the right of way is 30 meters. And with this cross-section, it's possible for you to provide for public transport in the form of BRT. There's adequate space for your motorized traffic with 2 lanes on either side. And then on the extreme edges, you can also see you've made provision for the footpaths. And also all the street elements have been provided. There are nice footpaths, there are some vending areas. You can also provide the underground utilities. I saw in the chat box that this is a main concern on the road agencies when they're implementing the roads. But you find that no ducts are provided along the road. The ducts are only provided across the road. So you can see in these, there's some space for provision of utility boxes, street lights, and all the elements have been combined to provide a good degree of urban mobility. Moving on to the very wide streets, this is an example. For example, like on Ladika Road Corridor, the streets are some streets are very wide, where you have up to 60 meters right of way. And it's possible for you to, it's always good to have a dedicated corridor that is for you to move the masses. As you saw, it's always good to have a good, utilization of the road space by making provisions for the public transport. So this can be done in the form of BRT in the median. Then you have your space for the motorized traffic. There is adequate carriageway for the other road users. Also, you can provide adequately for your cyclists. And also, it's always good to do some good landscaping by provision of trees. Then the other chapter that has been provided in the manual is the chapter on intersections. And what you find that intersections have always been a point of conflict. There's always conflict between the through traffic, that is the motorized traffic. There's also conflict with the pedestrians who are trying to make across from one side of the intersection to the other. And you also have conflict with the other modes of transport. There are the cyclists. You can see there's a cyclist here, there are borders guy. But when it comes to design, these you can see these are the junction of Ojiji Road. And you can see where the proposed crossing has been provided. There is a form of pedestrian marking. But this is actually how people travel. You see, pedestrians always want to make the direct crossing from one side to the other. And you can see what has happened to the grass in this median island or in these islands. So it's always good to design your intersections, enhancing the continuity of your footpath. Also, this is was a proposed cycle track, but what happens when the cyclists get to this junction? There's no provision for the cyclists at this area. This is another example along Gong Road. You can see there's a nice carriageway, which was, this was Gong Road phase 1. There's a nice carriageway for the movement of vehicles. But what happens to the cyclist? You can see a signboard has been provided that this should be the cycling lane. But what would happen? Is it really possible for people to cycle along this kind of section? It's very narrow. And what happens, you find that the cyclists would end up trying to share the same space with the motorized traffic. And you know the behavior of Kenyan drivers, the matatus, they rarely respect the cyclists and other road users. Something else you can see on this photo, there was an attempt to make a provision for a cycling lane on one side. But what happens when you get to the junction? Our cycle tracks are not continuous. Also, our footpaths are not, they don't appear to be continuous. And this poses a safety hazard. Also for the physically challenged, it's not possible for someone who is using a wheelchair to access, to make it across one side to the other side of the street. So these are good examples of how the intersection can be done. This is an example from Barcelona. And you can see it has made provisions for all the road users. The pedestrians are well catered for. The crossings are direct, so you don't need to take detours when when crossing from one side of the street to the other. Then there has been provision of some median islands, refuge islands. That is where pedestrians wait as they wait for the vehicles to pass and then make it across. So these are good design, and this is what should be implemented in urban streets in Kenya. Something else is we don't have refuge islands within our intersections. You can see this is someone, a physically challenged person, and they are forced to share the same space. And you can imagine the speeds at which vehicles are trying to cross at this junction. So there's need to make provisions for some refuge islands. And I can see there has been provision of a big guardrails, and people cannot be able to be catered on these refuge islands. A good attempt has been made. This is a good design along Lower Kabete Road. There's been provision of refuge islands where people can wait for the vehicles and then make the cross. So these are some of the designs that needs to be implemented on ongoing corridors. Something else, you find that there's a lot of conflict with the right-turning vehicles, especially along the Brt corridors. And it's always good to avoid the right turns at the Brt intersections, because these are, when the right turn vehicles, they tend to interrupt the continuity and the through movement of a Brt. So some of the ways in which you can minimize the conflict, the right turns, you can either have the 3 left turn, you can also have a left turn together with a U-turn, and then also you can have another scenario of the left turn together with the 2 right turns, so that when the Brt, when the vehicles get to this junction, they don't have to make any right turn. And this has been enforced in Dar es Salaam. You can see this along a Brt corridor. And the right turns have been, there are no right turns. So this minimizes the interruption, the movement of buses. And so by so doing, you're able to move more, you're able to ferry more people within our urban areas. So you can see these are signboards which restrict the right turn maneuvers at the intersection. So I can hand back to Chris to take us the next chapter on the ongoing projects.
Great, thanks, Gitao. So thanks for everyone for bearing with us this long, and I'll just go through a quick final section. And here, what I'll do is to show how some of our streets can be retrofitted to incorporate the elements that we're talking about in the street design manual. So first I'll take the example of the Kasarani Mwiki Road. And so you know this one's currently being upgraded, and this is the cross section that was prepared. And the main concern here, you know, it does include some footpaths, but it's basically a rural road cross section with the footpaths tacked on. And so there are a lot more elements that we need to include if we really want this to be a complete street that's in compliance with Sdmuak standards. So to give an idea of how that could look, you know, one point is that this street does carry public transport. In fact, a lot of public transport. So we by all means need to have good space for bus shelters and for people to wait for public transport. So that needs to be included. Because of the heavy vehicle volumes, it would be good to have cycle tracks on this corridor. So we could include cycle tracks on both sides. And then finally, it needs to have shade, because if you've been out on the street, it doesn't have a lot of trees today. So we should keep the ones that are there, but we definitely need to include new trees in the cross section. And one thing you can see is that in order to accommodate these elements, we've had to go to underground drainage. And I think we're going to find this in a lot of our streets, that if we really want to have a complete NMT environment, have complete facilities for public transport, we're going to have to shift to underground drains. So that's an example of a smaller street. Let me give an example of a larger street. So this is the part of Waiyaki Way from James Gachuru to Uthiru. And here you can see that there is a provision for the median aligned BRT. So this is quite good. I mean, this is exactly what the manual is talking about in giving priority to public transport. And it's gone a step further in actually reserving extra space for the passing lanes based on the service planning data that were done for this corridor. So this is a good example of the public transport inclusion, and probably the remaining room for improvement here would be to have a cycle track, because it does have a footpath on each side with a pretty decent width of 3.4 meters. But it's a main road in the city and definitely needs to be part of our future cycle network. So that would be the thing to include. We have the Nairobi Expressway. This is the 27-kilometer stretch that's running through the city. I think the cross-section really needs to prioritize public transport and NMT, as we've been discussing a lot during this session. It has about 16 lanes for cars on this stretch, but we really need to get the dedicated space for public transport, because that's what's going to ensure that this project is future-proof and it's able to carry the majority of the road users. It also needs to have NMT. So, just like the stretch from Lot 3 on Waiyaki Way, this stretch should also have dedicated cycle tracks. So that's the expressway. We could take another example in Magadi Road. So this is the cross section. It's currently basically a 1-by-1 lane road. And the proposal here was to add 8 lanes, to expand it to 8 lanes for mixed traffic. It has minimal footpaths. I think at this point, the footpaths were about 1.5 meter. I'm sure we can do much better than that. Here's an example of how that corridor could incorporate public transport. After all, it is on the gazetted BRT network. It's one of our BRT corridors. So having the dedicated public transport lanes that can help resolve a lot of the jams that we have at the Matatu stages today. And it also has enough width for a good cycle track and footpaths. It's also important to consider the commerce. There's a big market area in Ongata Rongai. And so, how can we include the vending areas and make sure that this road can still, play the role that it does in the local economy. And then we move to Mombasa. Here's the Mombasa Malindi Road. This is a similar cross section to Magadi Road, where it has the 8 lanes. It really needs the public transport facilities. It needs cycle tracks. It needs wider walkways, because this is one of the main NMT corridors in Greater Mombasa. So here's an example of taking the same exact 37-meter right-of-way and how we can create space for a very high-quality BRT with passing lanes, and also include the cycle tracks, the walkway, And we can have a more efficient two-lane carriageway because we will have consolidated the public transport in the BRT lanes. And so now we can free up the mixed traffic movement. So I think we can achieve more efficient movement for the private vehicles as well. Okay, and then finally, let's see a couple of visualizations of what this could look like on our streets. This is on Moy Avenue in the CBD. And we have the central 4 lanes and then these wide service lanes with quite a lot of parking, some matatu staging. And we can convert that into a really accessible cross-section with much wider footpaths. We can still have mixed traffic access, but really prioritize the public transport because this is one of the key arteries for BRT line 2. Okay. And then finally, we can retrofit our streets. So we have Thika Road. We can upgrade from the painted lanes that are there to implement the proper BRT with passing lanes, with the median line stations, and make sure that we free up the public transport from all the congestion that occurs on this corridor, and hopefully convert a lot more people to shift to public transport. So those are the examples. I hope this has given a good overview of what's in the Sdmuak. We can really shift from what's been the traditional focus of building a lot of roads for cars, even though that's not really how our people move in Kenya, and moving toward a more sustainable approach where we add public transport, we have more compact neighborhoods, and we can have better quality of life at the end of the day. So that's it for our presentation. I'd like to thank the IEK for hosting the session, and we really look forward to all the questions in the Q&A coming up.
Yeah, I would like to take this opportunity to once again thank Itdp for the great presentation. It's indeed a great manual coming up, and I believe you will benefit a lot from the input of the many engineers in this forum. So I would like us to proceed straight to the Q&A session. So I will take a few questions posted on the chat. Perhaps about 5 at a time, and then invite the Itdp team to respond. And the first question I would like to start with is to do with the name of this street design manual. There's a question posed by Engineer Timothy Okech that this should really be called a guideline and not a manual. I think the idea that manuals tend to be more prescriptive as opposed to guidelines. So that is the first question. The second question is to do with the issue of inadequacy of the road corridor. This is a question posed by one Sani Muli and Engineer Michael Ogola. The idea is there are certain road corridors which are currently already very narrow. So how do we retrofit? I think that has been alluded to already on the chat as a response, but perhaps you can just expound on that a little more. That's the second question. The third question is to do with the separation of non-motorized transport from motorized traffic. And this is to do with the issues such as encroachment of footpaths by hawkers, kiosks, the need to provide, say, for motorbikes, so that we don't end up having these ones interfering with the operation of the walkways. So that is the third question. Then the fourth question is to do with facilities for vulnerable groups, how we are addressing the idea of having pathways from origin to destination for disabled people, for instance, on wheelchairs. I think this has also been alluded to, but if you don't mind expounding on that. Maybe we start with the those first 4 questions. So I would invite ITDP team to respond to those before we proceed to the next set of questions. So ITDP, over to you. I believe crisscrossed. Great. Yeah, thanks a lot, Justice. Yeah, and maybe if the host could unmute all the ITDP team, my colleague Engineer Jerry and Gitao, then they can also contribute. But I'll start with a couple of the questions. So first, there was a question about the, whether this is a manual or a guide. It is a manual. It's part of the existing, set of road design manuals that are there in Kenya. And it's meant to fill the role as part 2 of that series because there was an old draft prepared in 2001, but it was never finalized and adopted. So the goal now is to really come up with a definitive urban street design manual that can become part of that series. And as I mentioned before, it's not trying to capture all the elements that are contained in other manuals, because there are other manuals in the series that do talk about subjects like materials, pavement design and thickness, road markings, drainage. So we're not attempting to go into detail on all those that are covered in other manuals, but what we want to do is talk about how all these elements come together in an urban street design, and then refer people to the guides that'll provide more detailed guidance on those specific elements. And I think the other point I'd mention is that to respond to this idea of, whether should a manual be very prescriptive, and this is, we have to be careful with that, because a lot of street design is about really knowing how to observe the conditions on a street, how to collect data, how to analyze the information that we're getting, and how to turn that into a final design. And we try to, we haven't talked about it a lot in this presentation today, but there's a section in the manual on the implementation of the guide, and how to do data collection, like what kinds of things what data should we be collecting that we're not already collecting when we go to do street designs. And so a lot of what we're trying to stress is that process, because it's much more about that process to produce a good street design. It also involves community participation, so it's not just a matter of applying formulas, but we need to talk to the local users, talk to public transport operators, really understand the conditions in order to prepare a good street design. I've seen some of the comments on, including more guidance on, warrants for adopting certain designs. That point is well taken, and we'll definitely try to have more concrete guidance. In some of the previous sessions, people have raised questions about, what should the width of a footpath be based on the demand, or same thing for a cycle track. We can incorporate more of those standards in the manual so that there's clear guidance. So we will definitely try to incorporate those points and appreciate that feedback. For the question about inadequacy of road corridors, we've addressed this a bit, but yeah, the point is that we can retrofit our streets. It's all a matter of deciding what we're going to prioritize, because we're going to face constraints, and a lot of street design is about how to manage those trade-offs, right? Because usually when in manuals that are very prescriptive, you can't possibly achieve all the things according to the formula for each respective element. And so we really need to have a clear process, and we want the manual to describe that process for dealing with those trade-offs. If you cannot fit the ideal size of everything, how are you going to set the priorities and still ensure that the cross-section works? And then finally, for the question on vulnerable groups, yeah, this is really important. It's something that we've ignored for too long in our street designs. We need to make them more accessible. And we've highlighted some of the elements in footpath design and crossing design, but we really need to think about moving toward urban streets that have, where people with disabilities have access to the whole cross-section, that they're welcome in our streets. They're not relegated to staying at their homes because they simply can't get out into the public space. So that's something that's important, and we'll also work and see if there are standards that can be expanded to deal with that. But I could turn it over to my colleagues to add some comments. Yes, I think back to the Itdp team regarding the issue of encroachments of footpaths, how you intend to address that. And I believe you are still on it. So we are waiting for you to handle that.
Sure. So for encroachments on footpaths, there are a few things. So we need to make sure that the physical design works in the first place. So part of that means having adequate bollard spacing. We can keep close spacing on some of our bollards, but we need to make sure that we don't prohibit the universal access on our walkways. So at least one set of bollards needs to have wider spacing. And then to manage, in parking encroachments, it's the same thing. Like we need to protect our walkways with bollards. They need to go all the way around the footpath. So you may have seen on Gong Road Phase 2, the bollards are put right along the property entrance, but then you can sneak around and access the whole length of the footpath. So having proper bollard spacing. And then finally, we need to think about the vending management. And that means having some designated spaces for vending where it makes sense, but then also regulating vending, because we cannot just have vending happening everywhere. We need to have clear spaces where it can work, but then we need to restrict it beyond those locations. So yeah, I can let my colleagues also chip in.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. What I can say about vending is often we do not provide space for vending, and you find that when people are not provided for, they create their own space. Perhaps we need to do it differently by providing the space and working with them as people who need a living, because they are on our streets because they need to make a living. It's not something that we are going to sweep under the carpet and think it's going to disappear overnight. So we need to provide for them. We need to work with them. We need to enforce, because I know during a former mayor, the late Raku's time, the enforcement in Nairobi City was very serious. This thing of people parking on footpaths, encroaching anywhere, or throwing pieces of cigarettes and papers anywhere was very strictly enforced. And the city was very clean. So the question of enforcement comes in a very big way. So we need the proper designs, we need enforcement, but we also need to educate our people. We need to sensitize, to create the awareness. And you'll find that when the right designs are done, even the drivers start respecting the crossings, people start changing their behaviors. As Chris mentioned, in Dar es Salaam, it's becoming apparent that drivers are starting to respect the pedestrians more. They are starting to respect even the pedestrian space more. At the moment, many people don't know that the pedestrians are supposed to have their rightful space on the roads. So if you stop, actually I remember one time I stopped for pedestrians to cross, and a car which was behind me was really hooting that I should move, and the lights were red for cars and green for pedestrians. So there is that. I don't know whether it's ignorance and awareness or whatever it is, but we need to create it. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Jerry Mburu, for those clarifications. Perhaps as you continue, you may I propose that you focus also on the issue of footbridges in the guidelines to provide adequate footbridges, and in terms of location. You alluded to that during the presentation because pedestrians tend to cross at the most convenient of locations, and you find that some footbridges are not in use. So I don't know how the manual tends to address the issue of grade separated crossings for pedestrians, because the art grade crossing, similar to the one that was shown during the presentation, doesn't seem to work very well in this country, or should I say in this part of the world, because of the behavior that Njeri Mburu has just alluded to, that motorists don't seem to respect pedestrians. So maybe you just address the issue of footbridges and specifically address the issue also of the motorcycle menace, motorbikes. Thank you.
Let me talk about footbridges briefly, and maybe Chris can also contribute to that. This manual discourages use of footbridges for many reasons. That one, footbridges do not provide for universal access. They are very inconveniencing for pedestrians. You find that you have to walk a very long distance. It increases the time, your walking time, than just crossing at grade. Also, most of the footbridges are not safe for pedestrians. Another thing we should ask ourselves, why are people not using footbridges? It means there's something that they don't like about it. There's something which is not functional about footbridges. So perhaps even we should do studies and actually find out, because there is a study that was done which established that most of the accidents are actually happening very close to the footbridges, and when people are trying to cross the road. So we need to change, because we assume that once we put a footbridge, everybody, all the pedestrians are going to walk there and they are going to cross. So it's not working. It's not working, it's not safe, it's not user-friendly, and it needs to be changed. In other places where pedestrians have been given priority, at grade crossings are used and they are working. I was very happy to see the raised tabletop crossings on Gong Road by Kura. Well done, thank you very much. Because not only do they provide the universal access, they also slow down the vehicles. So one thing we need to do is slow down the vehicles in the urban space and then provide at grade crossing. Then everybody is going to be able to use the road safely. I don't know whether Chris, you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I think that part of the reason for the challenge with footbridges is that we've been confusing the highways and the urban streets. Most streets in our cities need to be designed as urban streets with reasonable speeds of 50 kilometers per hour. And they will have stoplights. They'll have stoplights, they'll have at-grade crossings, and that should be the approach to make sure that they're much safer for all the users. Now, we might have some streets like Southern Bypass that we decide are going to be the free roads that don't have any signals. And so in those limited cases, it may be appropriate to have footbridges. But I think the problem is that we've seen footbridges creeping onto all of our urban streets. Whereas that's too much. For most of these streets, they need to have safe at-grade access. And for the behavior, the behavior is not immutable. We've been really impressed by what's happened in Dar es Salaam, because just to explain that story, first the BRT bus drivers were instructed that they needed to stop for pedestrians. So they do that. So they wait for the pedestrians who are walking into the station. And what started happening is bit by bit, the car drivers who saw the buses stopping, so then the car drivers also started stopping for pedestrians at the at-grade crosswalks. And so within that relatively short period of time, the whole driving culture has changed, right? And now people stop for pedestrians. So it's something we can change in Kenya too. We don't have to live with this, the respect that most drivers have for pedestrians. We can really change that, and we can make it much safer for these at-grade crossings to function. And once you have good crossings at regular intervals, then you can have some barriers in the middle of the street to make sure that people are crossing at the designated crossings. We don't need to make it a complete free-for-all, but in order to do that, we need to have enough good crossings that people aren't inconvenienced, because then they won't try to jump over barriers and things like that if they have frequent places to cross safely.
Well, thank you very much, ITDP, for those clarifications and insights. I would like to move to the next set of questions. And the first one is to do with the provision for services. And it's a question asked by Engineer George Maderi about the design guide, including layouts dedicated for utilities. And this could be tunnels to minimize disruptions. When roads authorities, as you've seen in the chart, these service companies want to get their cables across, then they have to cut through the road or even along the road. So maybe just some insights on how this manual proposes to deal with the issue of services and all manner of services, telecommunication cables, water lines, power lines, and so on and so forth. So that's the first question. Then the next question was a very specific one, which you also alluded to, raised by Engineer Chege, about whether these guidelines will be implemented on the Nairobi Expressway. I think you alluded to that. So that is the second. And then the third one is to do with the issue of street lighting, which you again alluded to. And this was a question raised by Kiprop and Dennis Tonui, the issue of street lighting being part and parcel to improve safety along the walkways. Maybe we take those three and then we move to the next set.
Okay, I think I can start off. I can answer the question on the utilities and service ducts. More often, what do you find that when the road constructions are being done in the BOQ, a provision is made to make provisions for the service ducts. But the challenge is that these ducts are only provided across the road. So we don't have any service ducts which are provided along the road. And so you find that after the carriageway has been done and sometimes some nice footpaths are done, then in the future you find there is always challenge where these, the fiber optic cables are being laid. There is issues to do with the sewer line connection, issues to do with power lines. And so one of the best approach to go about this is when the road constructions are being done, it's always good to make a provision for the service ducts which are running along the road. And they need to be placed within the furniture zone so that you don't have like the manhole covers or some of the utility boxes obstructing the movement, the continuity of our footpaths. And this has been achieved in Kisumu. There was a recent upgrading of the Triangle project, where there were provisions of service ducts which are going to be used by different service providers. And they've been laid along the road. And also there is a provision of the service ducts across the road. Yeah. So Chris, I think you can add more on that for Engineer Jerry.
Thank you, Gitong. Yeah, I think it's very necessary, even when you're doing the designs, to include the utility providers, and we have alluded to that in the design process, that you need the participation of the utility providers during the design stage so that they can give their input at the design level. And from there now, the design can well accommodate the utilities. For whether the Nairobi Expressway will be designed based on the street design manual, we all hope so. We truly hope the expressway is going to be fully compliant with the street design manual, because this is line 1 corridor, which is supposed to run from along Mombasa Road and up to Wayakiwe. So the expressway, if it does not follow the street design manual, then it's going to be a very difficult situation, like the situation we are having on Thika Road, where the BRT was not included in the design. And then you find a situation where we want to implement a BRT, and it becomes very expensive, very complex to retrofit what was left, what was not included in the initial project. So if the Kenha is on board, it is very, very important that we fully use, or rather, the design of the expressway needs to be fully compliant with the street design manual so that we start moving in the right direction. We do not want to continue having all the problems that we are having. It should have proper public transport and adequate NMT. There are so many people walking on Mombasa Road. We need adequate NMT. We need our environment protected. We need landscaping. It's the road from the airport. So we need people, when people arrive in Nairobi, they need to see a smart city, beautiful city, and without traffic congestion. Thank you very much. Maybe Chris, you can add to the expressway.
Yeah, I think you've covered it pretty well. Yeah, the BRT line 1 is a high capacity, high demand corridor. So it needs to be designed with the requisite facilities. And that means having high capacity stations, having passing lanes at the stations, making sure that the interruptions to the BRT lanes are minimized. So those are all factors that could be included in the design. And yeah, on the subject of the NMT, I think that's critical to include, because we're showing that at the beginning of the presentation that Mombasa Road, for there are large stretches that don't have any footpath at all, and no cycle facilities. So we need to make sure that when we're doing a big investment along the corridor, that we make sure that we improve the situation for the NMT users and make it much safer to walk and cycle along Mombasa Road. Yeah, I think there was one more question about street lighting, and what I would stress there is just that what's important is to consider the pedestrian scale lighting, in addition to the lighting that we typically install from, say from the carriageway median, because sometimes that light doesn't reach all the way to the footpaths. And so what we're recommending in the manual is that for wider rights of way, that we actually have separate sets of lights at a pedestrian scale that are concentrated on the NMT zone of the cross section. And that can help us, improve safety and security on the, for the NMT elements.
Thank you, Itdp, for those clarifications. The next set of questions. Engineer Bill Ocheng is seeking clarification on the idea of subways and overhead cable vehicles. What is your take on that as a method of navigating the congested Nairobi street? That is one question from Bill Ocheng. The second question is from Meshak, who wants to know that if this guideline seems to focus on NMT, non-motorized traffic, why not have NMT design guidelines? And why not have congestion management strategies? That is a question from Meshak. Perhaps you can delve into that. Then the third question is about improvement of our rail system. And this is a question from several people. There's Engineer Makanga, there's Nyagaka, George Kagia, Patricia Karumi, and several others. They're wondering about the idea of improving our rail system as a mass transit system. And they're also alluding to the recent idea that was on the news about development of the railway city or metro network. So perhaps you can delve into those three questions before we proceed to the next set of questions. Over to you, Itdp.
Okay, great. Yeah, we were just muted for a moment. So I'll give a couple of comments first. So metro's rail systems. So we should make the good use of the commuter rail network that we have now. And I think there are already plans underway to bring a few more coaches onto the network. So let's use that as best we can. But I think the point for rail in general is that the cost, if you take light rail and tramways, they usually cost at least 5 times as much as a BRT. And the capacity is the same or lower because for a BRT you can have passing lanes which significantly expand the capacity, but an LRT would not. And then a metro would cost 10, 20 times as much as a BRT line. So I think the key question is, with a limited transport budget that we have, how can we bring high quality public transport service to the majority of residents in our cities, in Nairobi and Mombasa and elsewhere. And we can do that most efficiently with BRT because for the same investment, we could build one line of LRT, we could build half a line of metro, or we could build BRT across all of our main arterials, basically the 5 gazetted corridors in Nairobi. And then for cable cars, these are mainly relevant for cities that have a lot of level differences, where there are extreme slopes, and it's actually hard to bring a bus service. So yeah, I think most of our cities in Kenya are relatively flat, so cable cars wouldn't make as much sense as regular matatu or bus services on the ground. And then for the question about the focus on NMT, that's because we have 40% of our trips in Nairobi by foot, right? So we need to give much more emphasis to NMT than we have in previous manuals and in previous designs, right? So we really need to make sure that NMT users are well accommodated on our streets, that they're safe. And for congestion management, I think that's a good point. We need to have a proper parking policy in Nairobi and other cities. So there was a draft parking policy for Nairobi that was developed by the EU consultant last year. And so we need to see how that can be taken forward. Parking policy really needs to look at things like demand-based pricing, having better enforcement, electronic enforcement, so that we really know who's paid or who hasn't, and also to keep the cars off of the walkways, because that's one of the key parking management challenges that we have. And I think that deserves a treatment, in its own policy. I'm not sure it necessarily fits in this manual, because we're focused. I mean, we're looking at the geometric design of parking slots, but definitely there's a need for a parking policy and a much stronger approach to parking management. And let me turn over to my colleagues to comment a bit more. I think they need to be unmuted too.
Well, thank you for those clarifications. If there's no further input, I would like to move to the next set of questions. And the first one is to do with the air pollution control. What is your take on the issue of control of vehicular traffic emissions. So that is the first question. Then the next question is about how to deal with the access arising from settlements along the highways. And this is a question from Dennis Kemboi, who says that there's settlement along most highways, and with 50 kilometers per hour rule, these might cover very long stretches, and there might be the need for speed humps along those stretches. And what is your perspective on this? How do we handle this particular issue? That's the second question.
Okay.
And then the next question, which is more of a comment from Albert Onyango, is that traffic congestion should not be consigned to street design only. It is an urban planning problem. And traffic is a function of land use. So why not address it at the planning stage so that the land use does not result in generating large volumes of traffic? So that is the third question. Over to you, ITDP.
Great, thanks. So I'll answer some of them. Maybe while I'm doing that, if the host can unmute my colleagues, then they can also chip in. So for settlement access, yeah, that's a key issue. We need to have service lanes on our streets, so on the major streets, so that is a good idea, but I think it's more about how we design the service lanes so that they facilitate safe access for all road users. And I think the other thing we need to consider is that in a lot of cases, service lanes have been turned into public transport corridors. So we try to keep public transport staging and access out of the express lanes and shove it into the service lanes. But actually we should be doing the opposite. We should be prioritizing public transport, putting it in the median of our streets. And then that way the service lanes can provide more of a slower speed local access function, right? They won't be the kind of high speed thoroughfares that they are today, because certainly if you go to a street like Thika Road, the service lane is like another highway. It's actually very scary to cycle there. And so we need to change the designs of the service lanes. To address the first question about the urban planning, yes, we need to have an integrated approach to land use and mobility planning. And a major component of that is making sure that we have more compact development so that people don't need to use motor vehicles in the first place. We should have housing that's close to where people are working, close to educational opportunities, and so that people don't have to make commutes of 30, 40 kilometers. We have a number of people commuting daily from Thika every morning. Let's provide compact, affordable housing close to our centers of commerce so that we don't have those long trips. And it's key that we get the design of infill projects like Railway City right. So, the latest plans that we saw for Railway City incorporated a huge number of new off-street parking spaces. And we all know how congested the Nairobi CBD is today. And so if we add thousands more parking spaces to that, we're gonna have even more people trying to come to the CBD in their cars. And so that'll really push in the opposite direction. So we need to have better planning principles, really try to minimize the parking supply in congested areas and make sure that the parking supply is calibrated to the capacity of the streets in the area. And I'll turn it over to Njeri and Gitao to comment more.
Well, thank you for that input. There's the issue of vehicular emissions. I think that's the only pending issue that we await your take on.
Yeah, let me get that one. So we need to have cleaner vehicles. So that applies to both private vehicles and our public transport fleet. So first of all, to clean up we need to clean up the private vehicle emissions and also reduce the total number of private vehicles. Because what a lot of cities have seen is that even if they have marginal gains in the private vehicle emissions, then over time, if the total vehicle fleet is increasing still, then you erase all the gains that you had through vehicle technology. So we have to look at both parts, like changing the vehicles, but also managing travel demand by private vehicles. And then the second part is for public transport. Our public transport today is really dirty. Our matatus don't meet any emission standard for the most part, and we need that to change. So Kenya, along with other East African countries, has reduced the sulfur content in the fuel here. So we're able to use at least Euro 3 buses, and within a short period of time, even Euro 4 and 5. And so we need to make sure that all new buses that are procured in the country meet at least the Euro 3 standard, right? That should be a bottom line for any vehicles that are coming on the road. And then along with that, we need to have a proper enforcement regime. So it's there on paper right now, but we need to put it into force, so that vehicles go to regular emissions checkups, and we ensure that there's good maintenance over time, so that if even if they met the Euro 3 spec, for instance, at the beginning, that they continue to have low emissions throughout the lifetime of the vehicle.
Well, thank you very much, Itdp, for those insights. The next set of questions is, there's a direct one here from Charles Ruate. I don't know if you'll be able to take this. Perhaps he says, is a CS Transport fully committed to fully implement this brilliant design guideline? It's about commitment from government. That's the first one. Then the second one is the issue of parking spaces. Your take on the same. It's about adequate provision, but there's also the issue of restricted access. So probably you can delve into that bit, the issue of underground parking facilities. What is your take about this parking problem? That is the second question. Then the third one, I think, has already been answered on the chat about sharing the presentation in soft copy for ease of reading later. I've seen you've already shared that on the chat, but I also want to suggest that you still share the same with the IEK, so that we can continue engaging even after this.
Okay, great.
Those are two questions. Maybe you can take on those first before we move on.
Yeah, sure. I can start with those. So first of all, yeah, we very much look forward to working with the CS Transport to implement the Sdmuak. And there's been really great support from Engineer Francis Gattal and his team in facilitating a lot of these dialogues that we've had over the past few months. And so we've gotten really valuable input from the engineering fraternity and elsewhere, and plan to make a lot of these updates in the manual over the coming months. So look forward to continuing that collaboration. For parking spaces, so I touched on this a bit. Previously the approach, just as with road building, the approach was often to build more and more parking, thinking that would solve the problem, right? But I think what's increasingly recognized is that parking is an important travel demand management tool. And so instead of increasing the supply indefinitely, we really need to focus on managing the existing supply better. And so that means having demand-based pricing. So, where demand is higher, we should have higher parking fees, and also getting the right balance between on and off-street parking. Because what's been true for a lot of years in the Nairobi CBD is that on-street parking is much cheaper than off-street parking. And so the on-street parking ends up being over-occupied, and yet there's actually a net supply of spaces. It's just that people aren't using them. And so we think that there's a supply of, we think that there's a shortage, but there actually isn't. There are actually a lot of parking spaces that people could use, but because of the pricing signals, they're not able to find them. And then we actually need to reduce the parking supply in areas that have good public transport access. And so what a lot of cities are doing is to remove minimum parking requirements, which has been the traditional approach in our planning rules and building control rules, and especially within walking distance of public transport. So in the Kenyan context, that would mean we could take our BRT network and say within a 500-meter radius of every BRT station, there shouldn't be any minimum parking requirement. So that would be a place to start with parking. And yeah, and finally, yeah, I think we need to look at ensuring that we don't provide new public parking. So I recently heard some discussion about turning the sunken car park into a multi-story parking structure. That's the kind of project that we should avoid because it'll simply bring more cars into an already congested area, and we can better use that funding to help improve our public transport and build better NMT facilities in the city center. So thanks. And yeah, regarding the presentation, we will share the slides.
Well, thank you very much, Itdp. There are many, many more questions, as you can see on the chat. I will pick a few of them. The intention was to wind up by 1.
Okay.
And, so we'll attempt to do that. And I suggest that then any other questions that may not have been answered, we will still, this session is being recorded, so we'll still pick them up with the Itdp. We have a transport subcommittee at IEK, which deals specifically with the transportation sector issues. And we'll be very happy to work with you in that subcommittee so that we can move this agenda forward.
Okay.
The next question is from Tony Onyango, who says, has any transport modeling been done with respect to, say, Nairobi, so that we might not end up with more congestion in some years to come once this is adopted? So that's a question from Tony Onyango. Maybe you can take on that.
Yeah, sure. So yes, a number of modeling exercises have been done. Of course, the JICA master plan model was prepared for that based on the household survey. So it was kind of a, macro scale zonal, large zone based model. And then more recently, we worked with NAMATA over the course of last year to prepare a separate model for the public transport network. So we collected more detailed information, with stop-by-stop OD information for the public transport network in Nairobi. And that's what we've been using to help develop the service plans for BRT. So I think we have very good data on the public transport and the regular traffic system in the city. And that information's available. And everyone's welcome to use that to help plan. And I think they're, to answer how we can use that to try to avoid congestion. Yeah, I mean, we need to make sure that we size the public transport systems adequately to handle this demand. The public transport demand in the city is not insignificant, and it requires robust infrastructure designs and service plans in order to cater to the demand that's there. Just on line 2, what we had calculated is that we need 600 articulated buses to meet the demand that's there in the morning peak. So, you can get the sense that it really requires serious solutions, and that's something we could, we're happy to work with you to develop going forward.
Well, thank you for those remarks. I'll move on to a few comments from members on the webinar. Engineer Grace Kagondu says, thank you presenters from Itdp. A good document there for transforming our cities. As IEK Capacity Building Committee, I believe this is useful knowledge to all engineers, not only in traffic, highway engineers, for enhanced point of design discussions. That's a comment from Engineer Kagondu. Another comment from Cheriot saying that this webinar is very informative, thanks to Itdp and IEK. Then there's a comment from Oscar Wafula, who says a manual calculates elements like bus lane capacity, pedestrian lane capacity, etc. If it doesn't, then it's not a manual, but a guide. I think it's to do with the issue of whether to call this a manual or a guide, but that has been answered already. Then an issue raised by Stephen Gigi, there is the issue of shop loading bays. How are they to be handled? Maybe you can take on this, Chris.
Okay. So yeah, so for those questions, yeah, I think on the bus lane capacity, pedestrian capacity. So for bus lanes, we've talked about that a lot in the Brt Design Framework. So that would be the reference. And then and then as I said earlier, we're happy to add a bit more guidance on the capacity of walkways, cycle tracks, and so forth. And yeah, for the second question, I think I may need you to repeat that. Sorry.
I think those were largely comments, but the real question is the issue of shop loading bays.
Yeah, sorry, the loading bay
being handled. Shop loading. Yes.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, that's a good point. So we definitely need to have access for freight services in our city centers. And I think in the past we haven't necessarily kept that in mind when allocating parking spaces, and so we end up giving up all the space for long-term car parking, and so you end up with blocked faces that don't have any space for freight loading, and then the vehicles end up having to stop in the carriageway lanes. So having dedicated space for this is important. We also need to think about the advent of ride-hail services that many people are using now, and the fact that we need to have access for those also at the curbside. So it's really pointing toward more flexible use of the curb space in our main commercial areas, and repurposing some of the parking spots that are currently taking up a lot of space. And one thing I might add is that in Nairobi, NMS has been looking at even bicycle parking, because that's something that's also been missing in the street design. So really taking a multimodal approach to how you manage the curb and ensuring that you minimize the conflicts with the traffic movement that still needs to happen.
Well, thank you for those insights. Then we go to a comment from Peter Wandai, Engineer Peter Wandai. He says, whereas we are trying to minimize motorized traffic from our urban roads as much as possible, I didn't see any prescription for parking spaces for the fewer motorized traffic we hope to end up with, including private motorcycles, which nobody gives much attention, yet promotion of more use of private motorcycles can also significantly reduce the number of private vehicles. What is your take, maybe just to sum it up, what is your take on the issue of use of motorcycles? I think we had alluded to it a little earlier.
Yes.
How are we dealing with the motorcycle usage in this country is very high. All these urban areas, there's lots of motorcycles. What is your take on control of that?
Yeah, the motorcycle use is rising fast. So there's no doubt about that. And we need to see how to manage this in our mobility system. And I think the first point I'd make is a lot of the reason that people are using motorcycles is because of the severe congestion that we have in Nairobi and other cities. And so people are jumping on the motorcycles to get out of traffic. And so that means that if we really want to manage the demand for motorcycle use, we need to think about what alternatives we're providing so that people don't need to sit stuck in traffic. So having good public transport, having dedicated lanes for the public transport where possible, and having dedicated lanes for cycling so that that's safe, because often cycling can be an alternative for short trips that people would otherwise take by motorcycles. Now, when it comes to allocating the on-street parking, motorcycles use the space a lot more efficiently than cars. So yes, we should have dedicated space, and define where motorcycles can park along with other vehicles. And we also need to think about the staging for our boda-bodas, because right now, on many streets lack designated stands for boda bodas, and so they end up just jumping onto the footpath or whatever space is convenient. And so that ends up blocking pedestrians and other road users. So we need to have allocated spaces for boda bodas so that are compatible with the overall street design. And this is, thanks for bringing up the comment. It's come up in several of the discussions we've had on Sdmuak over the past few months. And so this is something we'll definitely incorporate in the parking section going forward.
Well, thank you very much. We are now already at 1, and I want to suggest that there are very many questions and issues being raised on the chat, and because of the interest of time, we may not be able to cover all of them. So I suggest that we keep sending these comments. I'm glad to note that as we speak, we have 425 participants, and it peaked to about 460. So there's a lot of interest in this subject, and I therefore propose that ITDP continues working with IEK to collect as many more comments as possible and address this even after this webinar. So I would like us to then move to the next bit away from the question and answer session. And I would like to invite the Honorary Secretary to make her remarks. I don't know if the Honorary Secretary is in the room. Engineer Guy? Then I would like to invite Engineer Kiteme. Is Engineer Kiteme in the room? Engineer Kiteme? Yes, I can see he's in the room. Engineer Kiteme, over to you for your remarks. Can you please unmute?
All right, thank you. Thank you, Engineer Twani. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for ITDP members. My name is Engineer Shama Kiteme. I am a council member. I did not introduce myself when the president was introducing council members. Just take us shortly on a session on the way forward, as I mentioned there. From the onset, we had a good presentation from Engineer Francis Gitau, who highlighted key issues in terms of the participation of Ministry of Transport. Everyone is hearing me, please?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes,
oh, thank you, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, so we had a very good presentation from Engineer Francis Gitau from the ministry. And we know that he took positively the issues that were raised by the president. And then he pointed out the issue of sustainable urban mobility. And obviously, members have really given very many comments in the chat. I was just following. For the ITDP team and the ministry, this is a step in the right direction, clearly. And I also noticed that Chris and Engineer Njeri Mburu have invited members to give input on the document itself. And I appreciate that, yeah, these kind of documents are quite organic documents that will keep on getting improved as we move forward. Personally, the first time I heard about the manual was when we were involved in doing the building code. You know, the country has been looking at the building code, which was last done in 1968. And I remember a staff from ITDP, I think, yes, in sessions we had, she was very vocal. Penny, so that's good to note that going forward, the building code will be factoring in the provisions of this manual. And I thing for us as engineers is basically to be ambassadors of the principles espoused in this document, which are very important. The principles that have been very well articulated, including design for safety, design for efficiency, hierarchy, really presenting the pedestrians as high in the hierarchy. And it was interesting to note from the presenters that about 40%, 45%, and 53% are working people in our towns in Nairobi, Mombasa, and Kisumu. And also the other aspects of pavement design. And we all know that road fatalities are quite high in our country, and there are those concerted efforts. So it's for us really to put in our mind every time we are involved in this, and as engineers, we are doing the road design. So basically, I think the principles of this guide and put them into practice, continually give our input that are coming up. And I have noted like Ngong Road, very good features. You drive in there, I mean, I use that road and you can see the features are very good that has come up. So continually getting better on all these areas. So we will focus also as IEK to document some of these best standards and manuals, and it is captured in our strategic plan so that we can provide a forum where engineers can continually access the materials and they are available for their use. So I believe all of us, and from the sentiment of everyone, they will continuously Engineer Maderi, that whether it will remain to be called a manual or not, but we all agree on one thing, that the concepts are very good, and sustainable mobility is definitely the way to go, and especially in urban areas. So thank you very much, everyone. Let's continue engaging, as Engineer Twani has said, and even give more ideas. And then IEK will want to continue to be bridging some of the best principles that we can continuously use to add value into our practices. Thank you very much, Engineer Twani.
Well, thank you, Shama, for those remarks. I now invite our Honorary Secretary, Engineer Margaret Ogai, to make her remarks. Welcome, Engineer Ogai.
Thank you, Engineer Twani. Mine is to make a vote of thanks. I would like to appreciate all the participants who have been here with us. I'm told they peaked to 460 at one point. We are still 400. That means we have had a very good engagement. Thank you all for coming. This was really for yourselves. And what was the purpose? Why did you come together today? We wanted to sensitize you, and I think we've achieved that. We also wanted to get feedback on the manual. That has also been achieved. I think we've got a lot of good engagement. Thank you so much for your participation. I'd also want to thank our Infrastructure Secretary, Engineer Getau, who was here with us for gracing the occasion. We appreciate the leadership that is coming from the ministry, and we look forward to further engagements with them so that we can take this manual to the stage of implementation. Itdp team, we thank you so much. You have partnered well with Kenya Roads Board. Let me also admit that Engineer Njeri was also my classmate. I'm told people are declaring their interest. So Engineer Njeri, thank you so much. I think you have been very passionate. Chris, Cost, and the other team members, we're really excited. It's a great document, and I think you have seen the kind of engagement there is. You have the right audience who want to implement the manual. I think the question that is coming around, is it a manual or a guideline? And I think that will be addressed. Those are some of the comments that are coming your way. I would like to also, I think what I like about the manual, let me just keep a little bit in the manual. Thanks, I know Engineer Shama, I would not want to repeat, you have said it well. On the manual, I think I like the rights-based approaches that it has taken, and we need to go towards sustainable transport. So I think that is one thing. I'm sure many people say that engineers have we are hard science, but I don't think it is true. It's a question of engaging us. When you engage us, we're able to provide the solutions for society. I would like to thank the organizers of this conference. I think we have the team from IEK was led by the Capacity Building and Mentorship Committee, Engineer Grace Kagondu and her team. We also have the Policy Research and Advocacy team that was under Engineer Otwani. Thank you so much. This has been truly successful. Of course, we couldn't have done this without the Secretariat led by Engineer Linda Otieno. I think it's always good to, before I end, because we are going to move to the next stage of implementation, there was a way forward that was given to you. I think we have to walk the talk. We have the manuals, we have the knowledge, but how are we going to implement it? My challenge to you engineers is that we have to start participating in policy and planning. I think we are so ready, we are on the other side of things, at the implementation side of things, but that things have already been decided. If it is budgets, they have already been provided or not provided. And so we must find ourselves in that stage. We must, I think it is capacity building and the policy team. Let us up our game as engineers, because I think we have focused ourselves to be at the implementing side. It is very exciting to implement projects, but policy is where it also happens. And quite often, all this we are talking about, if I may say, to disappoint Chris and your team, it's all about where the budgets are coming from. We say we are going to provide, 200 million for a project, which clearly needs 300 million for you to do all this. There's that trade-off, and the trade-off usually happens on the person who pays. So I don't want to go too much, because mine was to just give a vote of thanks, but really, I think this has been very, very exciting. I have with me, I think, council members who I think should talk. I think Engineer Lucy Mutinda, if you're in the house, I'm praying you're in the house. I would like to invite you to close. She's the first vice president, and therefore it is only in order that she also comes to give one remark, and then we can call somebody to close this meeting with a prayer. Engineer Lucy, are you there? Or you're also muted like I was? In that case, I would like then to hand it back to Engineer Justice Otwani, but to thank you all. Thank you so much, and ITDP, let us continue engaging. Thank you.
Hello?
Yes, Lucy.
Sorry.
Welcome.
Sorry, I think I was muted. Did I interfere? I was muted.
You're welcome. I wanted you, as my first vice president of the institution, I wanted you to just give your little last remarks, and also you can close for us with a word of prayer. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Engineer Margaret Onsek, for inviting me, and thank you very much to our members, to the organizers, to the presenters. We are very grateful to have you. The attendance was overwhelming. It's a very good show that our members are interested in learning what's best in policy and what we need to implement. And not to belabor on what Engineer Margaret has said, I would encourage engineers to really be part of advocating for policy, because we have all these great papers on ideas on paper that would really make our country great. But if we just focus on working, rolling out, and not influencing policy, where a lot of stuff is where it happens, then we might be left behind. So as mentioned by Engineer Otwani, we have the PRAC committee, Policy Research and Advocacy Committee, that has subcommittees that are focusing on policy in different sectors. This is to encourage all members to really take part, give us your input on social media, on email, on all the platforms where we are available. We are happy to incorporate. So thank you very much, ITDP. It was a very enlightening webinar on the street manual design and sustainability and all the things we need to think about to be very pedestrian sensitive. And we look forward to working with all of you further. So without any further ado, a final thank you, and I wish to lead with a prayer to thank our Almighty God. Okay, let us pray. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Dear Lord, we thank you this afternoon. We thank you for the fact that we've been able to sit here with a great attendance, Father. Our engineering fraternity is eager to learn the best things to implement. All we pray, God, is that you empower us with the will and the ethics and to work correctly and really implement these great ideas that will make our country great. Dear Lord, as the leaders of this fraternity, we pray that you're going to give us wisdom to lead the members in the right direction, that we shall also influence the future. We pray that there are students, there are young people that were able to sit here and they're learning the best practices so that our country proceeds sustainably. Dear Lord, we want to thank you for the gift of life. We know there is the COVID menace that is ravaging the entire world, the entire globe, Father. We pray that you're going to finally eliminate this and that you're going to give the doctors and all the professionals the ability to be able to come up with a cure to this disease. We have lost many in our fraternity. We have lost dear ones. Father, we pray that this ends. Continue gifting us with the gift of knowledge and power to be able to implement things, and we shall keep praising you. We pray all this trusting and believing in Jesus' name. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen.
Well, thank you very much, members. This brings us to the end of this session. I wish you a great afternoon and a great week ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.